I used to think stability was underrated. Not happiness, the loud, cinematic kind, but the quiet certainty that your life made sense when you woke up in the morning. 34, I believed I had that. Maybe not perfectly, but enough. My name is Daniel. I'm 34, a project manager for a construction firm based in Portland, Oregon. I manage timelines, budgets, and people who don't like being managed. It's a job built on problem solving and compromise. I was good at it. Too good, maybe. I brought that same mindset home. Claire and I had been married 7 years. No kids. Not because we didn't want them, because we kept saying later. Later when work slowed down. Later when things felt more aligned. Later became a habit. Our apartment sat on the edge of the river, modern but slightly impersonal, the kind of place you rent when you think you'll upgrade someday. Gray walls. Clean lines. Too quiet at night. We furnished it carefully, thoughtfully, like two people trying to prove they were adults who knew what they were doing. Most mornings followed the same pattern. I woke first, made coffee, watched the city stretch awake through the window while the kettle clicked and hissed. Claire usually emerged 10 minutes later, already checking emails, already somewhere else mentally. We used to talk in the mornings. Not about anything important, just small things. A news headline, a weird dream, plan for the weekend. Over time, those conversations thinned out, like a river in late summer. That Thursday morning felt ordinary enough. Claire stood by the counter, scrolling through her phone while the toast burned slightly in the background. "You're going to miss your train," I said. "I know," she replied, not looking up. Her phone buzzed. She tilted it away instinctively, thumb moving fast. I noticed it only because it was new. She hadn't always done that. I didn't say anything. We'd been emotionally distant, but I told myself it was temporary. Work stress, different schedules, the usual excuses couples use when they don't want to ask harder questions. I still believed in us. Or maybe I believed in the version of us I remembered. That evening, she came home later than usual, heels in hand, jacket draped over one arm. Her perfume hit me first, sharp, citrusy, unfamiliar. She'd changed scents recently. Said the old one felt too safe. She dropped her bag on the chair and leaned against the kitchen counter. "I'm going out tomorrow night," she said, casual. "Drinks with Maya and some people from work." "Just drinks?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Yes, Daniel. Just drinks." The way she said my name felt defensive, like she was already answering a question I hadn't asked. "Okay," I said. "Have fun." She kissed my cheek, distracted, already reaching for her phone again. Later, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, a show playing neither of us was watching, I studied her quietly. The way her leg bounced when she read messages. The way she smiled at the screen and then wiped the expression from her face when she realized I was looking. I told myself I was imagining things. Friday came. She dressed with more intention than usual. Black blouse, hair styled carefully, earrings she rarely wore. She checked the mirror twice. "You look nice," I said. "Thanks," she replied quickly. "It's kind of a work thing." She left around 7. I stayed in, ate leftovers, answered emails I didn't need to answer. By 11, I was half asleep on the couch. She didn't come home until almost 2. The door clicked softly. She moved quietly, like a guest in her own apartment. When she slid into bed, she stayed on her side, back turned. I caught the faint scent of cologne that wasn't mine. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily. The next morning, she was distant. Short replies, irritable. When I asked how the night was, she shrugged. "Fine. Long." That was it. Over the next few days, little things accumulated. Her phone never left her side. Notifications silenced. Password changed. Calls taken in the hallway. If I entered a room unexpectedly, she'd lock the screen too quickly, like a reflex. I hate myself for noticing, for cataloging these details. I didn't want to be suspicious. I wanted to trust her the way I used to. One Sunday afternoon, we were sitting on the couch, light spilling in through the windows, dust floating lazily in the air. Claire had left her phone on the coffee table while she went to the kitchen. It buzzed. The screen lit up. I didn't mean to look. I really didn't. But the message preview was already there. Last night was hard to forget. Still thinking about your laugh. No name. No context. Just those words, sitting quietly between us. My chest tightened. My heart started pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. Claire came back into the room, saw me staring at the phone, and stopped. Just for a moment. But it was enough. "Who's that?" I asked, keeping my voice calm with effort. She picked up the phone immediately. "Work stuff." I nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't push. But something inside me shifted. A thin crack, almost invisible but irreversible. That night, lying in bed beside her, listening to her breathe, one thought kept circling in my mind. When did I become the last person to know what was happening in my own marriage? In the early stage of betrayal, the danger isn't the affair itself. It's the erosion of shared reality. Small behavioral changes trigger intuition long before evidence appears. The betrayed partner often suppresses this intuition out of fear. Fear of conflict, fear of being wrong, fear of losing the life they've built. Denial becomes a form of emotional self-preservation, even as it quietly prepares the ground for deeper hurt. After that Sunday afternoon, after the message that was not meant for me but somehow felt deliberately placed in my path, life did not fracture all at once the way people like to imagine it does when something is wrong. Instead, it continued forward almost politely, carrying with it an undercurrent of tension that made even the most ordinary moments feel faintly distorted, as though I were watching my own life through slightly warped glass. Claire did not suddenly become cruel or careless, which in some ways made everything harder, because she still asked if I wanted coffee in the morning, still reminded me to take my jacket when it rained, still sat beside me on the couch at night with her legs tucked underneath her, close enough to touch yet somehow unreachable, as if a thin, invisible wall had been erected between us without either of us acknowledging it out loud. What did change was the texture of her presence. The way she seemed perpetually half elsewhere, her attention pulled taut by something I could not see, like a thread stretched toward another room, another conversation, another version of herself that no longer included me. Her phone became an extension of her body in a way it had never been before, always within reach, always face down when she wasn't using it, always silenced but never truly quiet, because I could sense it even when it didn't vibrate, like a secret breathing in the space between us. I tried, at first, to respond the way a reasonable husband would, by giving her space, by telling myself that this was what adulthood looked like after 7 years together, 2 demanding careers, and 1,000 small disappointments that never rose to the level of fights but nevertheless accumulated in the corners of our lives, gathering dust. Still, there were moments when the dissonance became impossible to ignore. She started coming home later without explanation, or with explanations that felt hastily assembled. Stories about last-minute meetings or spontaneous dinners with coworkers that lacked the kind of mundane detail real memories usually carry. And when I asked gentle follow-up questions, nothing accusatory, nothing sharp, her answers came a beat too late, her eyes flicking away as if she were searching for the version of events she had already rehearsed. One evening, while we cooked dinner together, she laughed at a message on her phone and then immediately caught herself, her expression flattening as she slipped the device into her pocket. And in that brief moment I felt something inside my chest tighten, not quite anger yet, but something closer to grief, as if I were slowly losing access to a part of her that had once been freely mine. I found myself replaying old conversations in my head, looking for the moment where we might have taken a wrong turn without realizing it, wondering whether my own emotional distance had created the space she now seemed so eager to occupy with someone else, and that question, what did I fail to see, began following me everywhere, to work meetings, to the grocery store, to the quiet moments before sleep when the mind becomes its own worst interrogator. At work, I struggled to concentrate, catching myself staring at spreadsheets without absorbing the numbers, my thoughts looping back again and again to the same images. Her tilted phone screen, that unfamiliar smile, the casual way she'd said, "just drinks." As if the phrase itself were designed to disarm me. The first external crack came unexpectedly, during a casual lunch with Jonah, an old mutual friend who had known us since before the wedding, before life had become so carefully scheduled and emotionally negotiated. We were talking about nothing in particular when he mentioned, offhandedly, that Claire seemed energized lately, that she'd been talking excitedly about a new collaboration at work, and when I asked what he meant, there was a pause, subtle but unmistakable, followed by a quick attempt to change the subject. That pause lingered long after lunch ended. It wasn't proof, not even close, but it was confirmation that something existed beyond the borders of my awareness, that there were conversations being had about my wife that did not include me, and that realization settled into my chest with a quiet, steady weight. At home, Claire seemed increasingly sensitive to my presence, reacting defensively to even neutral questions, as though she were bracing for accusations I hadn't yet voiced, and there were moments when I almost wished she would simply snap, would give me something concrete to respond to, because this state of suspended uncertainty felt like emotional suffocation. One night, as we lay in bed with the lights off, she received a message that illuminated the room for half a second, and I watched her body tense instinctively, watched the way she angled the phone away from me before even opening it, a movement so practiced it suggested repetition rather than spontaneity, and in that moment I understood something with startling clarity. Whatever was happening, it had been happening long enough for her body to learn how to hide it. I didn't confront her then. Instead, I lay awake listening to her breathing, counting the seconds between each rise and fall of her chest, thinking about how strange it was that two people could share a bed, yet inhabit entirely different emotional landscapes, separated not by distance but by silence. The hope that had sustained me at the beginning, the belief that there was an innocent explanation waiting to be uncovered, began to erode, replaced by a heavier, more unsettling awareness that truth, when it finally arrived, would not be something I could easily fold back into the life we had built. And still, despite everything, a part of me clung stubbornly to doubt, to the idea that I might be wrong, because the alternative meant accepting that the person I trusted most had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to exclude me from her inner world. The tension became my constant companion, a low-grade hum beneath every interaction, every shared meal, every quiet evening. And by the end of that week I realized that I was no longer waiting for answers so much as bracing myself for impact. Standing on the edge of a truth I was not yet ready to name but could already feel approaching. This stage of betrayal is defined by cognitive dissonance, where emotional intuition and rational explanation collide without resolution. The betrayed partner oscillates between self-blame and suspicion, often internalizing responsibility for the other's secrecy as a way to preserve the relationship's stability. External validation, such as a friend's hesitation, can be profoundly destabilizing, because it confirms that the hidden reality is not imagined, but socially shared. The longer this phase lasts, the more the partner's sense of self erodes, replaced by hypervigilance and emotional exhaustion. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to investigate my wife. It happened more quietly than that, in small, reluctant steps, each one justified as temporary, reasonable, even necessary, until I realized I was no longer trying to reassure myself, but to prepare myself. The first thing I noticed was how carefully Claire managed information. Not just hiding things, but controlling the flow, what I knew when I knew it and how much. She volunteered harmless details, the kind that made her seem transparent, while the important parts remained untouched, sealed behind vague phrases like work stuff or nothing interesting. I began paying attention to timing. She'd text when she was on her way home, but not before. Calls came only when she was already alone. If I messaged her during the day, responses were delayed, thoughtful, almost curated, as if she were making sure her tone revealed nothing accidental. At night, she'd sit beside me, phone angled slightly away, scrolling with a half-smile that vanished the moment I shifted my weight. Once, when I reached for the remote, she flinched. Just a little. Enough to notice. I hated that these details mattered to me now. One evening, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I stared at it longer than I should have. I told myself I wouldn't touch it. I told myself that if I crossed that line, there would be no going back. Then it buzzed again. I picked it up. The screen lit my face in the dim room. No lock screen preview this time. Just the notification bar, partially visible before it disappeared. A name. Initials, actually. I didn't open anything. I didn't need to. The existence of that name, saved, abbreviated, hidden in plain sight, felt heavier than any explicit message could have. I put the phone back exactly where it had been and stepped away, heart pounding, hands unsteady, aware that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer guessing. I was confirming. The next few days passed in a strange fog. I functioned. I went to work. I nodded in meetings. But my attention was split, part of me always listening for the next inconsistency, the next slip. Came sooner than I expected. On Thursday, Claire told me she'd be staying late for a team dinner. She said it casually while tying her shoes, already halfway out the door. Where? I asked. Downtown. New place near the river. That night, around 10, Jonah texted me. Random question. Are you at home? I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Yeah. Why? There was a pause. Then, I thought I saw Claire earlier. Might have been someone else. My pulse spiked. Where? East Side. Coffee bar near Hawthorne. That wasn't downtown. And it wasn't a team dinner. I didn't respond right away. I sat on the couch, lights off, the apartment quiet around me, feeling something harden inside my chest. Not rage yet, something colder, more focused. When Claire came home after midnight, she looked tired, but not the way work tired someone. Her hair was slightly mussed. Her jacket smelled like cold air and something sweet I couldn't place. How was dinner? I asked. Long, she said. We lost track of time. She didn't mention the East Side. Or coffee. Or Jonah. I nodded and let it go. That night, while she slept, I lay awake replaying everything. The messages. The timing. Jonah's hesitation. The way she'd said long instead of good or fun. It all formed a shape I could no longer ignore. The next breakthrough was accidental. We were packing for a weekend visit to my sister's place when Claire asked me to grab her charger from her bag. I unzipped the front pocket and saw a folded receipt. It slipped out and landed on the bed. Coffee. 2 drinks. 2 pastries. Time-stamped during her team dinner. My hands went cold. I stared at that piece of paper longer than I should have. It felt absurd that something so small could carry so much weight. I folded it back carefully and returned it to her bag, my movements slow, deliberate, as if speed might shatter the fragile control I was maintaining. Later that evening, she sat across from me, legs tucked beneath her, talking about plans for the weekend. I watched her mouth move, listened to the familiar cadence of her voice, and felt an overwhelming sense of distance, as though I were already remembering her instead of being with her. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand the full shape of the truth before I decided what to do with it. That opportunity came the following Monday. Claire had left her phone charging on the kitchen counter while she showered. A message came through. This time, the preview stayed. Same time tonight? I miss you. There it was. Clear. Undeniable. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The words sat there quietly, glowing against the dark screen, asking nothing of me except acknowledgement. I stepped back, leaned against the counter, and closed my eyes. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even surprised. I felt something closer to clarity. For the first time since all of this began, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't failing to trust hard enough. I was being lied to, and that knowledge, as painful as it was, brought with it a strange sense of calm. Because once the truth is visible, even partially, it stops owning you. This phase marks the transition from emotional confusion to cognitive clarity. The betrayed partner often feels guilt for seeking proof, yet the accumulation of inconsistencies forces a moral recalibration. Self-protection replaces blind trust. Evidence doesn't just confirm infidelity, it restores the partner's confidence in their own perception. This is often the moment when pain becomes actionable, allowing the individual to move from passive suffering toward conscious decision-making. I didn't confront Claire immediately, even after the message from RM appeared on her phone with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Because once the truth finally surfaces, there's a strange instinct to hold it at arm's length for a moment longer, as if acknowledging it out loud will make it heavier, more permanent, less survivable. For 2 days, I said nothing. I watched her closely instead, not with suspicion anymore but with a kind of detached attention. The way you observe something that is already breaking but hasn't yet fallen apart. noticing details you once took for granted. The way she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly while reading emails, the way she laughed at a joke on television a beat too late, the way she avoided my eyes when conversations drifted too close to anything real. What struck me most was how normal she seemed. There was no visible guilt, no dramatic shift in her behavior that might have given me permission to react explosively. Instead, she moved through our shared space with practiced ease, confident in the version of reality she had constructed. And that quiet confidence unsettled me more than any obvious lie could have. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening, not because I planned it carefully, but because there came a point when continuing to pretend felt more violent than speaking. We had just finished dinner. The dishes were still on the table. The apartment was dim, lit only by the lamp near the couch, casting long shadows across the floor. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, steady and unremarkable, the kind of sound that usually made the space feel calm. I sat across from her and said, "We need to talk." She looked up, cautious but not alarmed. "About what?" I took a breath. "I saw the messages." Her face changed instantly, not into panic but into something guarded, controlled, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind without ever expecting it to arrive so quietly. "What messages?" she asked. "Don't," I said. My voice was steady, even to my own surprise. "Just don't." Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. She looked down at her hands, fingers interlaced tightly in her lap, then back at me. "How much do you know?" she asked. That was the moment everything settled into place. Not the confession itself, but the question, which confirmed that there was something to confess. "Enough," I said. "More than I wanted to." She exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she'd been holding in for months. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I didn't respond right away. I was too busy registering the finality of that sentence, the way it shifted responsibility away from choice and toward circumstance, as if betrayal were an accident rather than a series of decisions made in private. "Who is he?" I asked. She hesitated. "Someone from work." "That's not an answer." She closed her eyes briefly. "His name is Ryan." I nodded. The name landed without drama. It didn't need to be memorable. "How long?" I asked. "Since late summer," she said quietly. "Late summer. Months ago. While we were still planning trips we never took. While we talked about maybe trying for a child next year. While I assumed distance was temporary and fixable." "Did you ever plan to tell me?" I asked. She looked up at that, eyes glassy. "I didn't know how." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. She talked then, carefully, choosing words that framed her actions as a response rather than an initiation, explaining how lonely she'd felt, how disconnected we'd become, how the attention had felt unexpected and validating. And as she spoke, I noticed how familiar the narrative sounded, not because it was untrue, but because it was incomplete. I listened without interrupting. I wanted to hear how she justified the version of herself that now sat across from me. When she finished, she waited, watching my face as if searching for a reaction she could work with. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I considered the question seriously. "I'm thinking that you had options," I said. "You could have talked to me. You could have asked for space. You could have left. Instead, you chose secrecy." She started crying then. Quietly at first, shoulders shaking, tears sliding down her face in a way that might once have undone me. This time it didn't. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. "I know," I replied. "But you did." There was a knock at the door. We both froze. It was soft, hesitant, followed by a pause, then another knock, firmer this time. Claire's face drained of color. "Are you expecting someone?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head too quickly. I stood and walked to the door, my movements slow, deliberate. When I opened it, Ryan stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, uncertainty written across his face as his eyes met mine. "Claire," he said, looking past me. I stepped aside slightly so he could see her sitting on the couch, tear-streaked and silent. "She's busy," I said. "But I think you already know that." The silence stretched painfully between the three of us. "I didn't know she was married," he said finally. though the lack of conviction in his voice suggested otherwise. "That's not my problem," I replied. He nodded, muttered an apology that landed nowhere, and left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling an unexpected wave of exhaustion wash over me. Claire was sobbing openly now. "I'm done," I said quietly. She looked up, eyes wide. "Daniel, please." "I'm not angry," I said, "but I'm not staying." The words felt solid as they left my mouth. Not impulsive or dramatic, just true. In that moment, something inside me settled, not with relief exactly, but with resolve. I couldn't control what she had done, but I could control what I allowed next. Confrontation often reveals less about the affair itself and more about the emotional frameworks each partner operates within. The betrayed partner's clarity contrasts sharply with the betrayer's attempt to contextualize harm as unintended. True empowerment emerges not from emotional dominance, but from decisiveness, the ability to recognize when understanding no longer requires reconciliation. This moment marks the psychological shift from seeking answers to asserting boundaries. The days after the confrontation blurred together in a way I hadn't expected, not because they were chaotic or dramatic, but because they were strangely quiet, stripped of the tension that had dominated our lives for months and replaced by a kind of emotional vacuum that made even simple actions feel deliberate and heavy. Claire didn't leave immediately. For the first night, she slept on the couch while I stayed in the bedroom, the door half closed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of her crying through the wall, a sound that once would have pulled me toward her without hesitation, but now felt distant, as though it belonged to a different version of our relationship that no longer existed. In the morning, we moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing temporary shelter, avoiding eye contact, communicating only when necessary, and even then, in low, neutral tones that carried no expectation of comfort or reassurance. She made coffee. I thanked her. That was the extent of it. By the third day, she asked where I stood, her voice tentative, as if the answer might still be negotiated. "I'm going to move out," she said. "Just for now. Give you space." I nodded. "That's probably best." There was a flicker of something in her eyes then. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment that I wasn't fighting harder. But it passed quickly, replaced by resignation. We told people slowly, not with announcements or explanations, but in fragments. A conversation here, a text there. Most responded with sympathy, some with awkward silence, and a few with questions I chose not to answer, because I was learning, for the first time, that not every truth needs to be shared to be valid. Jonah came by one evening with takeout and didn't ask anything directly. He just sat with me, talked about work, about nothing, about everything except the thing that had just upended my life, and that quiet solidarity meant more than any carefully worded advice could have. The practicalities followed. Claire packed her things over the course of a weekend, folding clothes carefully, as if order might soften the reality of what was happening. I stayed out of the apartment when I could, walking along the river, letting the cold air sting my lungs, trying to recalibrate my sense of self without her presence filling every familiar space. When she finally left, she paused at the door. "I'm sorry," she said. Not defensively this time, but with genuine sadness. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. But knowing didn't change the outcome. Once she was gone, the apartment felt larger and emptier, but also lighter, as if something dense had been removed from the air. I opened windows I hadn't opened in months, threw out old takeout menus. I rearranged furniture, small acts of control that helped anchor me in the present. The emotional fallout came in waves. Some days, I felt calm, even optimistic, surprised by how quickly my body adjusted to the absence of constant anxiety. Other days, grief hit unexpectedly, triggered by memories that surfaced without warning. A song on the radio, a restaurant we used to like, the way the light fell across the kitchen in the late afternoon. I didn't romanticize what we'd lost. I forced myself to remember the silences, the avoidance, the way we'd both chosen comfort over honesty long before the affair began. That clarity didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context, preventing it from turning inward and becoming self-blame. A month later, we met with a mediator. There was no shouting, No bargaining. Just paperwork and decisions made with careful detachment. We agree on a quiet separation, no drawn-out conflict, no public drama. The marriage ended not with a collapse, but with a deliberate closing of a door. Signing the papers felt anticlimactic. I'd expected something heavier, some definitive emotional punctuation, but instead there was just a sense of finality, clean and irreversible, like stepping off a platform after a long wait. Afterward, I walked alone through the city, letting myself feel whatever came without judgment. There was sadness, yes, but also relief, and beneath both of those, a growing sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't managing a relationship that required me to guess, to interpret, to fill in gaps left by someone else's silence. I was only responsible for myself. That realization didn't make me happy overnight, but it made me steady, and steadiness, I was learning, was the foundation everything else could be built on. I started small. Morning runs along the river. Cooking meals just for myself. Saying yes to invitations I'd previously declined out of habit. I paid attention to how my body felt when I wasn't braced for disappointment. How my thoughts moved more freely without the constant background noise of suspicion. There were moments when I wondered if I could have done something differently, spoken sooner, listened better, fought harder, but those questions no longer spiraled. They came, lingered briefly, and then passed because I finally understood that responsibility in a relationship is shared, but betrayal is a choice. I hadn't chosen this ending, but I was choosing what came next, and that choice, quiet and unremarkable as it looked from the outside, felt like the beginning of something honest. Life didn't dramatically reinvent itself after the separation, and that surprised me more than anything else because I had half expected either devastation or sudden joy, some clear emotional verdict that would tell me how I was supposed to feel about the end of a 7-year marriage, but instead what arrived was something subtler and, in the long run, more sustainable. Normal days. I woke up alone now, not in a painful way, but in a neutral one, the kind that lets you stretch out in bed without negotiating space, lets you decide whether to get up immediately or lie there a few minutes longer listening to the city wake up outside the window. I started noticing small things again, the way light moved across the walls in the morning, the sound of my own footsteps in the apartment, the absence of that low, constant tension I had lived with for so long that I'd stopped recognizing its stress. I wasn't happy all the time, but I was honest. Life didn't dramatically reinvent itself after the separation, and that surprised me more than anything else because I had half expected either devastation or sudden joy, some clear emotional verdict that would tell me how I was supposed to feel about the end of a 7-year marriage, but instead what arrived was something subtler and, in the long run, more sustainable. Normal days. I woke up alone now, not in a painful way, but in a neutral one, the kind that lets you stretch out in bed without negotiating space, lets you decide whether to get up immediately or lie there a few minutes longer listening to the city wake up outside the window. I started noticing small things again, the way light moved across the walls in the morning, the sound of my own footsteps in the apartment, the absence of that low, constant tension I had lived with for so long that I'd stopped recognizing it as stress. I wasn't happy all the time, but I was honest. There were evenings when loneliness settled in quietly, when I cooked dinner for one and realized how many habits I'd built around sharing space with someone who no longer existed in my daily life. And in those moments, I didn't rush to distract myself or reinterpret the feeling as something else. I let it be what it was, trusting that discomfort didn't mean danger, that solitude wasn't the same as abandonment. Friends began to see a difference in me before I did. They said I seemed calmer, more present, less distracted. I laughed more easily, not because I was forcing myself to move on, but because I wasn't carrying the weight of unspoken questions anymore. Conversations felt simpler, cleaner. I didn't have to divide my attention between the person in front of me and the silent calculations happening in my head. I thought about Claire sometimes, though less often as weeks turned into months. When I did, the memories that surfaced were no longer only the good ones or only the bad ones, but a fuller, more balanced picture of who we had been together and why it hadn't worked, and that perspective helped me let go of the urge to rewrite the past into something more flattering or more tragic than it actually was. We hadn't failed because of one mistake. We'd failed slowly, through avoidance, through conversations not had, through the quiet agreement to postpone discomfort until it hardened into distance. The affair had ended the marriage, but it hadn't started the disconnect. Understanding that didn't excuse her choices, but it freed me from the burden of carrying the entire narrative alone. One Saturday morning, months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself sitting at a small cafe near the river, sipping coffee and watching people pass by, and I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anything to happen next. I wasn't anticipating a message, or bracing for disappointment, or wondering what someone else was doing when they weren't with me. I was simply there. That felt like freedom. I began thinking differently about relationships, not with bitterness but with clarity. I understood now that trust isn't just about believing someone won't hurt you. It's about believing you'll be okay even if they do. That communication isn't a skill you deploy when things go wrong, but a daily practice that keeps small fractures from becoming structural failures. Most importantly, I learned that staying in a relationship out of habit, fear, or hope for a future that never arrives is its own kind of self-betrayal, quieter than infidelity but just as damaging over time. I didn't leave the marriage angry. I left it awake, and that awareness reshaped how I moved through the world, how I listened, how I set boundaries, how I chose what and who deserved my energy. Some evenings, I still walk along the river after work, hands in my pockets, watching the water move steadily past the city, indifferent to personal histories and quiet revelations, and I think about how strange it is that loss can also be a form of alignment, that the end of something can restore parts of yourself you didn't realize you'd misplaced. I don't know what comes next in terms of love. I'm not in a hurry to define it. What I do know is that my life feels honest again, and that honesty, even when it costs you something, is a kind of peace worth protecting. Betrayal often marks the end of a relationship, but it can also mark the beginning of self-integration. When the betrayed partner reframes the experience not as a verdict on their worth, but as a lesson in boundaries, communication, and self-trust, healing becomes possible without bitterness. Quiet separation, though less dramatic, allows space for reflection and growth, turning pain into insight rather than identity. True empowerment emerges when one stops seeking closure from the betrayer and instead builds it internally.